Hey guys, tonight we begin with a love story, not the heart-fluttering, lute-playing kind, but the kind where you might need a helmet. Imagine standing across from your spouse, the one who once promised you forever, while holding a club in one hand and contemplating whether that marriage certificate counts as armour. Welcome to medieval Europe, where ending a relationship didn't mean changing your Facebook status or crying into a pint of ice cream. No. Here, if things got really sour, you could legally settle the score by beating each other senseless. And no, that's not a metaphor. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's listening in the dark. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're married, again, for the third time, maybe even the fourth, let's not count anymore. At first, you thought this one would be different. They seemed decent enough, had all their teeth, and didn't reek of turnips. But now the mask has slipped, and you're starting to wonder if till death do us part is more of a threat than a vow. In today's world, you might file for divorce or, at worst, deliver a scathing TikTok monologue. But in the Middle Ages, your options are creative. Let's set the scene. You're a modest peasant in 14th century Germany. Your house smells like old cabbage and sadness. Your spouse spends their time gambling, grumbling, and grinding barley into a fine paste of resentment. You've both tried everything grievance petitions, complaining to your priest, and passive-aggressively spitting in each other's porridge. Nothing worked. And then one morning, over a breakfast of disappointment and rock-hard bread, you remember there's a way out, a legal way, a fist-flailing, rock-throwing, crowd-cheering kind of way. It's called trial by combat, or as you prefer to think of it now. Medieval couples therapy with axes. And it's not a joke. This was a legitimate, court-sanctioned method to resolve a marital dispute. It could be used when one party accused the other of serious wrongdoing, like adultery, abuse, impotence, or even just being a terrible human with poor taste in table manners. In parts of medieval Europe, most notably within the Holy Roman Empire, spouses could quite literally beat the living vows out of each other in public combat. But this isn't some spontaneous bar fight with your partner while a minstrel plays the background score. Oh no, this is a formal affair. Think of it like the Super Bowl of bad marriages, except the loser might actually die, and the referee is a priest who secretly hates both of you. Now, depending on your gender, the rules change. If you're the husband, congrats, you're legally obligated to fight with one hand tied behind your back, standing waist deep in a hole like a confused carrot. You'll be handed 3 wooden clubs and a very brief moment to regret every decision that brought you to this point. If you're the wife, you'll be circling the pit like a hawk, armed with 3 stones wrapped in cloth and a fire in your eyes that says, "Remember the time you forgot my name at the harvest feast? You have the freedom to move around." He doesn't. That's supposed to make things fair. Spoiler alert, it usually doesn't. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you have to petition the court. You go before the judge, who's probably 60% political, 30% religious, and 10% asleep, and you make your case. Maybe your husband accused you of adultery. Maybe you accused him of being unable to perform his marital duties. Or maybe the two of you just can't agree on whose goat it actually is. Whatever the case, it's now his word against yours, and both of you are very enthusiastic about resolving it the most violent way possible. The judge listens, sighs, looks between you both, and thinks, again then. In his infinite medieval wisdom, he gives the nod, let the combat commence. Now preparations begin. You're allowed time to train, which mostly means swinging rocks in your backyard while the neighbour kids place bets. The pit is dug 3 feet deep and wide enough to ensure your husband can't shuffle out like a crab with trust issues. The townsfolk are buzzing. Someone's selling meat pies. Someone else is making a sketchy souvenir t-shirt that says, "I survived divorce by combat." Just kidding. Nobody does. And then the day arrives. You show up in your finest woolen Under Armour because nothing says intimidation like an itchy tunic. Your opponent, sorry. Spouse shuffles into his designated pit with the same enthusiasm as someone preparing for a dental extraction via mallet. A priest gives a short speech about honour, God's justice, and the importance of forgiveness. No one listens. Then the weapons are distributed. You get your 3 stones. He gets his 3 clubs. The rules are read aloud. The man must remain in the pit. If he touches the edge with his hands, he forfeits 1 club. If the woman strikes him while he's handing over a club, she loses a stone. No stabbing in the eyes, probably. It's go time. The crowd holds its breath. The town drunk yells, "Kick him where the sun don't shine." The judge nods, and suddenly you're in motion stone whirling above your head like a comet of vengeance. He blocks with his club and swings wildly, missing your head by a good 3 feet. You duck, you twirl, you shriek something that sounds suspiciously like, "That's for last Yule, you philandering turnip." Minutes pass, maybe hours. It's all a blur of bruises, sweat and stone dust, somewhere in the chaos. Your 3rd stone connects with his shoulder. He groans. You've drawn blood or possibly just dislocated a grudge. The crowd erupts. The priest adjusts his robe and discreetly places a bet. And here's the kicker. Whoever wins the duel is automatically considered innocent. The other guilty, no appeals, no retrials. No, "Can I talk to your manager" moment. Just medieval justice served fresh, with a side of public humiliation. If you win, you walk away free, probably with your goats, half the barley, and your pride restored. If you lose well, it depends. If you're the man and lose badly, you may be executed in the town square. If you're the woman and you lose, they bury you alive, because apparently nothing says justice like suffocating beneath dirt in a dress. So yes, trial by combat isn't just an urban legend or a Game of Thrones plot device. It was real, it was terrifying, and it was often the only way for some, especially women, to escape a truly hellish marriage, in an age where legal rights were scarce, especially for wives. Combat was sometimes the only option that didn't involve waiting for your spouse to drop dead from dysentery. And yet, despite how brutal it sounds, trial by combat was surprisingly structured, codified, even respected, in a disturbingly medieval way. It was a mix of law, theology, theatre, and sheer human chaos. A moment when marriage, morality, and melee weapons collided, sometimes fatally. And it's only the beginning, because as strange as this sounds, trial by combat wasn't even the weirdest part of medieval marriage law. Oh no, wait until you find out what happened when someone couldn't perform in bed, and the court demanded proof. You've just finished hurling rocks at your spouse in a legally sanctioned rage match, and now the judge is declaring a verdict based on who didn't get knocked out cold. But while the crowd cheers and someone passes around boiled turnips in celebration, your mind drifts back to when it all began. Not the marriage, the rules, the absurd suffocating rules that made divorce feel like more of a theological puzzle than a legal right. Because as much as medieval people loved their swords, they loved something even more: rules about marriage so strict you'd sooner escape a monastery full of bees. Let's step back a bit. You're living in medieval Europe, a place where marriage is less about love and more about land, livestock, and strategic alliances. And if you think you can just walk away when things get toxic, not so fast. By the 12th century, marriage had been scooped up and absorbed into the ever-expanding authority of the church. And the church, bless its solemn little heart, had a few strong opinions, namely marriage is permanent, sacred, and definitely not optional once the ink's dry. C. The concept of marriage being a spiritual, indissoluble union wasn't always a thing. Early on, think Roman Empire and Germanic tribal customs, divorce was more of a practical procedure. Didn't work out fine, take your goats and go, but as Christianity spread, so did its grip on morality, and once the church got involved, marriage stopped being a contract and became a sacrament. That's right, holy, inviolable, and judged not just by law, but by God himself, who, by all accounts, had a disturbingly strong opinion on your sleeping arrangements. By the late Middle Ages, wedding vows included the ominous phrase, "Till death do us part," which was not a poetic flourish, it was a legal warning. Marriage wasn't just binding, it was binding with the kind of permanence usually reserved for leeches and bad tattoos. The only way out, short of divine intervention or a conveniently placed plague, was death, or something called annulment, which we'll get to later, don't worry, it's just as absurd. Now, you might be wondering, how did this ironclad institution, or did people at least get to choose their spouses? That's adorable. No, if you were nobility. Your marriage was arranged by your family, usually before you hit puberty. If you were a peasant, you had a bit more flexibility, assuming your lord approved, because yes, even your ability to marry required feudal permission, and sometimes a financial fine called a merché, just for the privilege of saying, "I do." Imagine having to pay your boss before you could get hitched. Medieval life was nothing if not petty. The point is, marriage wasn't about affection or personal compatibility. It was a transaction, a way to secure alliances, expand estates, or move up the medieval social ladder. Your in-laws weren't people, they were strategic assets. Your wedding night wasn't a celebration, it was a merger. And should the merger sour, you couldn't just pull the plug, because that brings us to the real trap: divorce was almost never allowed. The church believed marriage symbolised the union between Christ and the church, so ending was basically blasphemy. And good luck explaining to the bishop that your husband's snoring was enough to break theological allegory. But people aren't saints, and marriages fell apart. Enter the creative solutions. If you couldn't get a divorce, you could try for a separation, a kind of medieval timeout. You'd stay married legally, but you were no longer required to share a bed, table, or awkward Sunday mass seating. It was the "I'm moving in with my parents" of the Middle Ages. But here's the catch: you still couldn't remarry. Not unless one of you kicked the bucket, and even then, people would gossip. Alternatively, you could aim for an annulment, a legal declaration, that the marriage had never been valid to begin with. This wasn't easy, and it required evidence, the more obscure the better. Was your spouse secretly related to you within 7 degrees of consanguinity? Annulled? Were you too young when you married annulled? Had one of you taken a religious vow and then forgotten to mention it? Big whoops, annulled. But the most popular reason, the crown jewel of annulment, claims non-consummation. If a marriage hadn't been physically completed, the church could reluctantly consider it null. And this, dear listener, led to a long tradition of painfully awkward public investigations into your bedroom habits, which we will get to in excruciating detail in the next section. Don't worry. It's worse than you think. For now, let's take a moment to appreciate how thoroughly trapped people were in their own vows. In a society that glorified suffering and martyrdom, staying in a miserable marriage was seen as virtuous. Wives were expected to submit. Husbands were expected to lead ideally without falling into a vat of mead. Abuse. Not a legal reason for divorce. Emotional cruelty. Sorry, try knitting. Infidelity. Maybe if you could prove it with credible witnesses and possibly a divine sign, like your spouse spontaneously combusting. Even the nobility weren't exempt. Royal marriages were notoriously cold. Political affairs. Kings and queens stayed together not out of love, but because diplomatic treaties hung in the balance, and when a king did want out, say, to chase a younger bride or consolidate power, it took years of papal pleading, bribes, and occasionally inventing your own religion, looking at you. Henry VIII. Historians still argue whether the Church's rigid stance on marriage helped stabilise medieval society or simply trapped thousands in lifelong unhappiness. Some claim it protected women by giving marriage legal weight. Others argue it stripped women of agency, especially since property laws often meant they couldn't even leave without losing everything. But here's the twist in some regions, particularly in earlier medieval centuries and among certain Germanic and Scandinavian traditions. Divorce by mutual consent was technically allowed. Couples could agree to part ways, return dowries, and go their separate peasanty ways. It just wasn't common, and as the Church's grip tightened, these practices faded like an old tapestry in a sunny tower. So what does all this mean for you, standing in that sweaty courtroom, wondering how you got here? It means your options are limited. You either prove your spouse is incapable of physical affection, fabricate a medieval Jerry Springer level scandal, or challenge them to combat, because when theology, bureaucracy, and barley all fail, there's always the blunt end of a club. And even if you survive, even if you win, the stigma doesn't just vanish. People will whisper, the Church may frown, and that weird uncle who still talks about saints appearing in his soup will definitely judge you. But at least you're free. Kind of. Maybe. Of course, that freedom comes with a price, especially if your next marriage turns out just as awful. Because remember, unless your new spouse spontaneously combusts or confesses to being your long-lost cousin, you're stuck again. And while divorce may be off the table, the public may still get involved, especially if someone accuses someone else of being physiologically unfit for marriage. Yes, it's time to discuss impotence trials. Trials where people were forced to prove under oath and under intense, humiliating scrutiny that they were physically capable of performing their marital duties. And let me tell you, nothing says romance like a court-ordered erection exam by now. You've probably figured out that medieval marriage wasn't designed with your happiness in mind. It was designed by men who thought bathing was suspicious and who measured virtue in how often you looked miserable. And if you were in one of those unfortunate unions that made you want to sleep in the pigsty just to avoid dinner conversation, you'd better start thinking creatively, because the Church didn't make it easy to leave. Till death do us part wasn't just a poetic phrase. It was basically a customer service policy. No returns, no refunds, no exchanges. But that didn't stop people from trying everything under the sun to find a loophole. And some of their attempts were, well, let's just say, inventive enough to make a modern divorce lawyer weep with envy. Let's start with a classic abduction. Yes, claiming your spouse had been kidnapped was one way people tried to erase the marriage. A woman might say she'd been taken by force and forced to marry under duress. This was technically valid grounds for annulment. Of course, you had to prove it. And if your captor was your uncle's cousin's friend, who just happened to own land next to yours and also really liked your goats, well, it got messy, but that didn't stop people from trying. On the flip side, a man could claim that his wife had already been promised to someone else. Or get this, that she'd previously married another man who later disappeared under suspicious circumstances, like falling into a well during a full moon. Did this other husband exist? No one knew. But sometimes, the rumour alone was enough to stall the marriage or cancel it altogether. And then there were table-sharing complaints. Yes, seriously, in medieval canon law, sharing meals with someone of the opposite sex, especially under the same roof, could be taken as evidence of cohabitation or even a common law marriage. Some took advantage of this loophole to sabotage their own or someone else's marital claims. Picture this: you've been married in the eyes of the village because you and your neighbour kept sitting at the same table to eat turnip stew every Tuesday. So, when you later try to marry someone else, your ex-table mate sues you for breach of contract, arguing that those stew nights were legally binding. It sounds ridiculous, and it was, but it happened a lot. Other absurd grounds. Witchcraft. Yes, if you could convince the church that your spouse had used potions, charms, or bewitched you into marrying them. Annulment granted. Did your spouse suddenly grow more attractive the night before the wedding? Maybe that wasn't just candlelight. Maybe it was sorcery. Better bring it up in court before you're stuck for life. Now, perhaps one of the most bizarre and mildly hilarious strategies was to claim you were related all along. Remember that whole no marrying within 7 degrees of kinship thing? Turns out medieval people weren't exactly drawing family trees with precision. So if your marriage turned sour, you might suddenly discover that your spouse's great-great-grandmother had once milked a cow on your grandmother's land, and voila, you were basically siblings. Annulment unlocked. Historians still argue whether people genuinely misunderstood the kinship laws, or whether this was just the medieval equivalent of claiming we were on a break. But there are dozens of records of people scrambling to find the most obscure bloodline connection, just to wriggle out of a miserable marriage. And if none of those worked, you could always try the old switcheroo, claim your spouse had lied about their identity. Maybe they had a secret spouse in another village. Maybe they were secretly a monk. Maybe they weren't even the same person you thought. You married identity theft. Medieval edition. If you could prove deception, it could invalidate the union. Take the case of a man who married a woman he believed to be a virtuous widow, only to later discover she was a nun who had fled her convent and changed her name. Was she sorry? Absolutely not. Was the marriage valid? Definitely not. The court ruled in his favour, and the annulment was granted. One can imagine him nervously rereading every future wedding invitation he received for the rest of his life. Then there's the crowd favourite adultery, a legitimate cause for separation, though not always for annulment, proving it was difficult. You couldn't just say, I think she's unfaithful, and be done with it. You needed witnesses, actual people who had seen the act, or at least someone sneaking out of the hayloft, suspiciously often. Even then, the church might encourage forgiveness. But if adultery could be tied with impotency or refusal to perform conjugal duties, that was a stronger case. One particularly determined woman argued that her husband never slept with her because he was too busy sleeping with everyone else. The church was so scandalised by the stack of witness testimonies she brought in. They not only granted the annulment, they fined the husband and ordered him to take a vow of celibacy. Harsh, maybe, satisfying undoubtedly. But let's not forget the pettiest of annulment attempts. Some couples claimed their spouse had bad breath, or that they snored so loudly it counted as cruelty. One woman tried to annul her marriage on the grounds that her husband refused to bathe. Despite living next to a perfectly functional stream, another insisted her husband's voice was too shrill and that she feared the devil had taken residence in his throat. The judges did not grant that annulment, but you have to respect the effort in some areas, especially in parts of France and the Low Countries. Town councils actually started keeping records of these disputes, not to protect people, but because the legal battles were so entertaining. Locals would gather at the courthouse like it was theatre. People bet on the outcomes. Some even claimed you could judge the health of a town's marriages by the number of annulment cases filed per year. Which brings us to one very uncomfortable truth. Annulments weren't really about truth or fairness. They were about narrative, about crafting a case bizarre enough, detailed enough, or dramatic enough to get the attention of people in power. It was less a legal proceeding and more a performance one, where the actors cried, pleaded, exposed embarrassing secrets, and prayed their bishop was in a good mood. So while it's easy to laugh at these medieval melodramas, remember these were real people, trapped in a system that gave them almost no exits. Annulment might sound absurd, but for many, it was the only chance at freedom, even if it meant claiming you accidentally married your own cousin, or that your spouse snored like a possessed ox. And for those whose creative attempts failed, for whom the loopholes closed, the excuses collapsed, and the church just shrugged. Well, when all else fails, there's still the pit, because if you can't argue your way out of a marriage with cleverness, you can always try brute force, or cis, and that means stepping into the ring or the hole, to be precise with your spouse, armed with a rock, a prayer, and more unresolved issues than the local monastery's wine cellar. You fail to argue that your spouse is your third cousin twice removed. The church didn't buy your story about being bewitched at the altar, and as for that claim about your partner being abducted by a pack of rogue nuns, bold, creative, dismissed. But don't worry, there's still one golden, thoroughly awkward card left to play in the game of marital escape, the impotency trial. And yes, you read that right. You want out of your marriage? Well, then step right up, strip down, and prove to a panel of complete strangers that your plumbing works exactly as advertised. Welcome to the medieval courtroom where the robes are long, the patience is short, and the stakes are as high as your dignity is low. This is the moment where you realise that the Middle Ages didn't just know how to complicate love, they turned it into performance art. Imagine walking into a stone courtroom that smells like damp wool and mild fear. At one end, your spouse sits fuming. At the other, a priest squints at your file. And in the middle, you centre stage, about to become the unwilling star of a very peculiar legal drama titled Rise and Shine or You're Legally Mine. So, how did we get here? The church believed sex was essential to a valid marriage, not because they were particularly romantic, but because procreation was the sacred goal. If a couple hadn't consummated their union, the marriage could be declared null. But, and here's the medieval kicker, it had to be proven. That meant witnesses, that meant testimonies, and that, sometimes, meant live demonstrations. Let's say your wife accuses you of being impotent. You deny it. She insists. Now, the court doesn't just take sides like it's a tavern debate. No, they conduct a full trial, starting with a basic question. Can you perform, or can't you? And you, poor soul, have to convince a group of sceptical, probably half-blind clerics that you are, in fact, capable of doing the deed. This trial begins with character witnesses. Your neighbours, friends, maybe even your mother-in-law, are summoned to answer humiliating questions like, has he ever shown signs of virility, or does he avoid women like the plague? The local baker might testify that you once blushed at the sight of a sausage. The blacksmith might swear you've never even looked at a haystack suggestively. Things escalate fast, but it doesn't end with gossip. Oh no, the church loved evidence. Which brings us to the most infamous part, the physical examination. You are ordered to drop your trousers in front of a panel of designated examiners. These could include priests, physicians, midwives, or a random handful of honest women from the community. These women were usually older, married, and disturbingly composed about what was about to happen. Their job to inspect your body for signs of function. You're not sick, you're not dying, but they still examine you like a prize pig at the spring fair. You stand there, cold stone floor, colder air, trying to summon both your courage and your circulation, while strangers lean in and comment on your most personal features with the dispassionate curiosity of tax collectors. If you succeed in displaying some life in the region, congratulations, you may continue your marital misery. If you fail, well, annulment granted. Of course, It wasn't always this simple. Historians still argue whether these trials were as common or as theatrical as the records suggest. Some argue the performance tests were rare, or more symbolic than literal. Others point to detailed accounts that are frankly hard to explain unless someone, somewhere, was indeed watching very awkward things happen under court supervision. Consider the case of a man in 15th century France who swore he was perfectly capable, but that his wife's body was somehow rejecting him. The court, unconvinced, ordered an examination. When the man failed to produce evidence of functionality, he blamed the witchy atmosphere of the courtroom. So, they tried again in a warm, private chamber, with incense and music. Even then, nothing happened, eventually. They declared him impotent, and the marriage was annulled. The man left town, presumably very quietly. In another case, from 1347, a woman named Matilda accused her husband of being entirely without heat, not metaphorically. She meant literally cold. He was examined, declared to be suffering from watery blood and chill humours, and promptly lost the case. A physician even wrote a short tract afterward, describing the event, likely with the kind of enthusiasm only a man who just got paid to diagnose medieval erectile dysfunction could muster. But perhaps the strangest element of these trials was the dueling testimony. If the man claimed he could function just fine, but only with certain people, the court sometimes ordered him to prove it with a surrogate partner. In one recorded case, a man was brought a woman from outside the village, placed in a supervised room, and instructed to demonstrate his faculties. It went exactly as awkwardly as you'd expect. The man blamed nerves, the woman blamed boredom. There was even a term for this ritual, congressus probativus, or proving congress. It was meant to simulate the act of marital union, to confirm or deny the possibility of consummation. And if your brain just shut down from second-hand embarrassment, don't worry, you're not alone. And it gets worse. If the man succeeded in performing with a third party, but not his wife, the court might rule that she was the problem, either through unnatural frigidity, spiritual interference, or demonic presence. In other words, if you couldn't stand your spouse, it was possibly because God had cursed her fertility or turned her into an emotional iceberg. Very scientific. In especially complex cases, both parties were ordered to undergo repeated examinations over several days to rule out the possibility of temporary coldness. That's right, you were expected to be consistently functional under pressure. Like a medieval espresso machine. If your performance flagged on day 3, too bad. The judge had already sent for the annulment papers and probably told his scribe to bring extra ink. It wasn't all doom for the accused, though occasionally people emerged from these trials with their reputations intact if deeply humiliated. One man, accused by his wife of being a flaccid fox, surprised everyone by performing so enthusiastically during his exam that the examining priest reportedly blushed and excused himself halfway through. The man returned home victorious, the wife less so. But if you think this only affected the lower classes, think again. Even royalty wasn't immune. Kings and noblemen who wanted to ditch wives without starting a war sometimes whispered claims of infertility or coldness. Knowing the courts would jump at the chance to get involved in royal body politics, these trials were part spectacle, part spiritual reckoning, and part social horror show. You weren't just defending your honour, you were defending your anatomy, your manhood, and, perhaps most insultingly, your bedroom reputation. The cost of failure wasn't just losing your marriage, it was losing face. In a world where legacy meant everything, a whispered rumour about your useless lance could haunt your family for generations. And yet, people still took the risk. Why? Because sometimes a little shame was better than a lifetime of misery, because in a system rigged with theology and social pressure, The only way out was through public humiliation. You wanted freedom, you earned it, with trembling knees and 6 bored midwives staring at you like they'd rather be anywhere else. And once the verdict was in, once the court declared you functionally flawed or unfairly maligned, there was no going back. The marriage ended, the records were updated, and you were, for better or worse, a free person again. But freedom came with its own dangers, because while this courtroom humiliation was the stuff of nightmares, what came next was a whole different beast, especially if you were a woman, because sometimes the only way a wife could escape a brutal or unwanted husband wasn't through argument, or evidence, or embarrassing examinations. Sometimes she had to pick up a club and step into a pit. So, you've made it this far, you've sat through the gossip, survived the scroll-waving priests, and you're still somehow married to someone you'd rather not see, even across a crowded field of cabbages. You've tried telling the church you were bewitched, kidnapped, emotionally bruised, and possibly cousins. No dice. Now, you're left with only the most desperate and frankly theatrical card in the medieval marital deck. Trial by erection. Yes, that was a real thing. Not a metaphor, not a joke. Yeah. A man could actually be summoned to a courtroom, flanked by witnesses, clerics, and a selection of women referred to somewhat terrifyingly as matrons of reputation, and be asked to rise to the occasion. Welcome to the most awkward chapter of medieval legal history, and you're the star of the show. The scene opens in a room not unlike a chapel vaulted ceilings, cold stone floors, and echoes that carry every whispered giggle to the farthest pew. Your wife, seated with a tight jaw and folded arms, has accused you of being incapable of fulfilling your marital duties. She's detailed the ways in which your wedding night was more like a funeral for romance, and the judge has nodded gravely. This is no ordinary domestic dispute. This is a test of divine function, and so, with all the gravity of a knight preparing for battle, you're ordered to prove that your manhood is, well, functional. The stakes, if you fail, your marriage is declared null, your wife walks free. You, on the other hand, are left with a public reputation for being incapable, a scarlet letter for the loins, and it doesn't wash off. Now, the logistics of this trial were as bizarre as they were humiliating, in most cases. The church wouldn't just rely on one man's word, or even his wife's. They wanted empirical data, or at least the medieval equivalent of it. That meant a physical examination, in which a panel of unpaid gynecological consultants, aka local women, selected for their moral standing and extremely poor luck, would gather to observe, touch, and heaven help us evaluate your most personal parts. But don't think this was some private matter, locked behind velvet curtains. No, sometimes these events were semi-public, attended by clerics, nobles, or townsfolk with nothing better to do than watch a man try and fail to perform under pressure. It was theatre, and you were expected to perform like your dignity depended on it, because it did. Take, for instance, the infamous case of Jean de la Bête, a 14th century farmer from Burgundy. His wife claimed he had been lifeless as a salted eel since the wedding day. Jean protested his innocence, so the court ordered the standard inspection, 5 matrons, 1 male doctor, and a bishop's clerk with a shaky quill ready to take notes. Jean was brought into a side chamber, given time and encouragement, and asked to demonstrate his virility. Let's pause here for a moment and reflect on the absurdity. Imagine trying to muster arousal in a freezing stone chamber, with 5 women over 50 discussing the weather while they wait for signs of activity below your belt. This wasn't a moment of intimacy, it was legal pageantry, and every part of it reeked of incense, mould, and anxiety. Jean, like many before him, failed. The matrons described him as pale, soft, and unresponsive. 1 more poetic than necessary, added that his member did not stir, not even when kissed with warmth. To be clear, yes, sometimes they tried to help, not for pleasure, for justice, because if you were going to ruin a man's life over his limp predicament, you had to be thorough. Naturally, this whole process created anxiety-induced impotence in many of the men dragged before the panel. And who could blame them, the church said. Prove you're a man, and did so by surrounding you with judges, stern women, and scribes with quills poised like executioners. If your knees didn't give out first, your ego probably did. In one well-documented case from 1395, a merchant named Pierre from Avignon was so nervous that he passed out during the trial. The judges allowed him a second chance the next day, and he still couldn't rise to the occasion. His wife, a sharp-tongued woman named Yvette, reportedly said, "He wilted like lettuce on a summer day." That quote made it into the court record. You can feel the burns 7 centuries later. And yes, sometimes a man could prove himself barely. If he managed to produce enough evidence of animation, the court might rule in his favour, but even then, he wasn't safe. The wife could argue that while he functioned now, he didn't back when it mattered, or only managed under duress, or only worked with strangers, which led to an even weirder variation trial by surrogate in especially contested cases. The court might invite a neutral woman, usually a prostitute, widow, or volunteer to enter a private room with the accused and see what happened. Yes, the church would rather fund that than grant you a divorce for cruelty or boredom. If the man could perform with the surrogate, but not with his wife, the church had a theological crisis. Was the wife cursed? Had she committed secret sins that withered her husband, or was he simply unfaithful, his loins stirred only by forbidden fruit? Historians still debate whether these surrogate sessions were widespread or just the stuff of rare scandal. But the records are there, and they are painfully vivid. And if you think this was a male-only humiliation, think again. Women weren't exempt from anatomical scrutiny. If a wife was accused of being unnaturally closed, too dry, or God help us, possessed of a hidden member, she could be summoned for her own inspection. A panel of matrons would examine her for signs of impediment to the marital act, and their findings could mean annulment, or worse, suspicion of witchcraft. You begin to realise, standing there in that courtroom, that love in the Middle Ages wasn't a quiet affair. It was loud, public, and often naked. But beneath the humour, there's tragedy too, for many. These trials were not just embarrassing, they were devastating. A failed erection in a courtroom could brand you as less than a man. A single matron's disapproval could leave you exiled from your community. And a successful trial didn't always win you your freedom. It just sent you back to a loveless bed you'd tried so desperately to escape. Yet still, people came, they stripped, submitted, and prayed their body would cooperate long enough to convince the judges. Because if it didn't, they'd remain trapped. And that was worse than shame. Because shame, you could survive. A marriage you couldn't escape, that was its own slow death. So now you ask yourself, would you do it? Could you stand in that freezing hall, bare as a babe, while 5 stone-faced women judge your manhood like it's a loaf of underbaked bread? Could you handle the whispers, the snickers, the permanent note in the church ledger that says failed in performance? Because if not, there's only one thing left. You'll have to fight, and this time, it's not a metaphor. So, you've proven you're physically functional. Congratulations, truly. You've stood tall, so to speak, in front of a panel of stern-faced matrons and cold-hearted clerics. And you made it through with only minor lifelong emotional damage. You'd think that'd be the end of the church's interest in your marital escapades. Ah, but this is the Middle Ages. If you thought the courtroom was invasive, wait until you find out what's lurking in your bedroom. Because in medieval Europe, sex wasn't a private matter. It was a matter of theology. What you did under the covers, how often. in what position, and with what emotional tone was just as important to the church as what you did at Mass on Sunday. And it wasn't enough to simply do it. You had to do it right, according to doctrine, in a church-approved fashion. Which brings us to the golden rule of medieval marital intimacy, missionary only. Please. Yes, the church had opinions, and no, they weren't shy about them. Here's the thing, sex in marriage wasn't about pleasure. It wasn't even about bonding. It was about procreation, the creation of children. That was its holy purpose, and anything that deviated from that was seen as suspicious, or worse, sinful. So when a husband and wife came together, they were expected to behave more like holy functionaries, completing a sacred task than two people enjoying each other's company. And if you're thinking, okay, but surely they didn't check. Right, oh they did. They checked harder than a nosy neighbour with a confession booth. If your neighbour suspected that you and your spouse were a little too enthusiastic, or that you were experimenting with positions that weren't strictly procreative, they could report you to the church in turn could investigate. You might be summoned, questioned, and if the accusations were serious, punished. Imagine this, a man is dragged before the bishop not because he didn't fulfill his marital duties, but because he seemed to be enjoying them too much. He is accused of showing signs of lustful vigour, unbecoming a God-fearing husband. His wife, red-faced but honest, says he growls like a lion and pounces with the energy of a demon. The bishop frowns. The scribes write it down. The verdict: excessive carnal enthusiasm, suspicion of spiritual corruption. Too much fun in the bedroom could invalidate the sanctity of your union. Let that sink in. Now, let's break down the official stance. According to medieval church teaching, the only acceptable sexual position was missionary man on top, face to face, no frills. Anything else was labelled as unnatural, animalistic, or demonic mimicry. That included woman on top because it suggested dominance, from behind referred to as sodomitic in some texts, standing up too chaotic, side by side lazy and indulgent. Mutual stimulation, we won't even translate what they called that, if that sounds overly strict. That's because it was. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas even argued that pleasure, while unavoidable, should be resisted. If you got carried away, if your passion overpowered your purpose, you were towing the line of sin. One wrong move, and suddenly your marital bed was being compared to a goat pen in the eyes of God. Historians still argue how deeply these doctrines actually affected ordinary people. Did villagers really live in fear of being caught spooning the wrong way, or was this mostly a concern for elites, priests, and people with nosy servants? The truth is somewhere in between, but the records don't lie. People were brought before courts over bedroom behaviour. One famous case involved a baker's wife who claimed her husband tried to perform the act like a dog, her words. Not mine. She was scandalised. The priest was horrified. The husband, he claimed he thought it might help with his bad knees. The church ruled against him and ordered penance, and no, they didn't give him a pillow. In another case, a nobleman was accused of engaging in relations with his wife during the wrong time of year. That's right, timing mattered. 2. Medieval calendars were full of forbidden days. Advent, Lent, Fridays, feast days, fasting days basically. Half the year was off limits. If you were feeling frisky in March, better check the liturgical calendar first, or risk a week of barefoot confessions. And then there's the matter of intent. You were expected to approach your spouse with solemnity, not lust. Approaching with desire was seen as dangerous. Even thinking lustful thoughts about your own wife could be considered a sin, which led to one of the strangest outcomes. In church law, a man could be punished for loving his wife too much. No, really. In 1231, a carpenter in Bohemia was accused of treating his wife with the affection of a suitor. The complaint that he spoke sweetly to her, gifted her small treats and kissed her neck before intercourse. His neighbours said he was enslaved by love. The priest said he was dangerously close to idolatry. He was sentenced to fasting and prayer. His wife was told to stop encouraging him. It wasn't just men who faced the pressure. Women, too, were scrutinised. A wife who showed too much interest in the bedroom could be labelled shameless if she initiated intimacy, or expressed preference, or, God forbid, enjoyed herself visibly. She could be accused of succubus-like behaviour. There are accounts of women being labelled as witches for showing inappropriate passion. One midwife in Milan told authorities that a certain wife had cried out during the act. The husband, embarrassed, took it to the bishop. The woman was scolded for her heathen noises. You couldn't win. Too much passion. You were sinful. Too little. You were withholding. One slip into laughter or affection, and suddenly your marriage was under divine review. And so, many medieval couples developed what scholars call pious coping strategies. Some recited prayers during intercourse. Some performed the act in total silence. Others, particularly among the nobility, wrote formal contracts outlining acceptable bedroom behaviour to protect themselves from future accusations. These contracts included phrases like no gripping, irregular ang. Let that live rent-free in your mind forever. But here's the part that truly boggles the mind. Some marriages were annulled because the couple loved each other too much. Not just physically, but emotionally. If a man said, "I desire her deeply," the church might interpret it as carnal obsession, unbefitting a holy union. One French nobleman was denied permission to remarry after his wife died because he was deemed to have valued her flesh above her soul. Imagine being so in love that the church tells you to tone it down. Still, couples found ways to navigate the rules. They whispered in the dark. They laughed quietly. They pretended not to enjoy each other, just enough to avoid suspicion. And sometimes, they didn't care. They embraced each other passionately, knowing full well that if the wrong person overheard, they'd be confessing with sweaty palms the next morning. Because when the rules are that absurd, sometimes breaking them is the only act of intimacy that feels real. But the church never stopped watching. Your bedroom was a confessional, your mattress, a moral battleground. And if you weren't careful, if your legs slipped to the wrong angle, or your breath quickened too audibly, you could find yourself summoned again. Not for annulment, not for impotence. This time, for combat, because sometimes, when sex couldn't be controlled, and love couldn't be purified, and humiliation had been exhausted, the only thing left was violence. Next time, you'll learn what happened when women took up weapons, dug their heels into the dirt, and said, "Fine, let's settle this in the pit." So far, your marital misadventures have included everything from spontaneous courtroom disrobing to ecclesiastical micromanagement of your favourite bedroom pillow. You've been measured, examined, morally corrected, and probably told not to enjoy Tuesdays too much. But what if none of that worked? What if your spouse just wouldn't budge, refused to annul the marriage, refused to perform marital duties, refused to stop snoring like a possessed accordion, and the church gave you no way out? Well then, grab a rock, roll up your sleeves, and prepare for divorce by combat. Yes, actual combat, with swords and slings and clubs, and rules so specific and theatrical that they make modern divorce court look like a gentle game of charades. And the most astonishing part, women fought too. Let's set the scene. It's a chilly morning in a rural German village, sometime in the 1200s. The town square has been cleared, a wooden pit waist deep, lined with straw, and roughly 12 feet across has been dug by the local bailiff and his sullen teenage assistants. On one side stands a man, stripped to his waist, holding a wooden club. his hand greased with pig fat to level the playing field. On the other, inside the pit, stands his wife, armed with a sling and 3 weighted stones. Her dress hitched up to the knees, her hair tightly braided, and yes, this is entirely legal, because in medieval Germany and in certain parts of Eastern Europe, a woman could challenge her husband to trial by combat in disputes where no other legal path seemed possible, not just for divorce. Mind you, these trials could also be invoked in property disputes, accusations of abuse, or just good old-fashioned mutual hatred, but when invoked for marital breakdown, the stakes were terminal. The rules, well, they were designed to make things fair, and I say that with the kind of heavy sarcasm reserved for rules like don't flinch during a dental extraction. Here's how it worked. The man had to stand in a waist-deep pit, with one arm tied behind his back. The woman stood above, outside the pit, with a sling and 3 stones. The man's weapon was a simple club, padded or blunted. The woman's stones were weighed and approved by a court official. If the man touched the edge of the pit, he forfeited. If the woman dropped a stone or slipped, she forfeited. And if either party was incapacitated, well, that solved the divorce question right there. Now, why such a setup? The pit was meant to handicap the man after all. He was assumed to be physically stronger, but don't let that fool you. This wasn't a friendly duel. These were brutal, bloody affairs. One thudding crack of the club, one well-aimed rock to the temple, and your marital problems were permanently resolved. If you think this sounds more like a gladiator match than a divorce proceeding, you're absolutely right. But in a society where women had little to no legal recourse, this was their legal recourse. Historians still argue whether these fights were symbolic or often fatal. Some records suggest most ended quickly, with one party surrendering or the court stepping in. Others tell chilling tales of broken limbs, shattered jaws and yes, deaths. In one documented case from 1228, a woman named Margareta killed her husband during combat by braining him with her second stone. She was not arrested. She was declared legally vindicated. The town, reportedly, held a modest feast in her honour. The baker made extra buns, but even when no one died, the damage could be immense. Public combat trials were humiliating. Win or lose, your business was aired for the whole village. Imagine standing shirtless in a pit while your wife, with perfect aim, shouts, "This is for never letting me visit my mother thwack. This is for selling my dowry goat wap. And this one's just for your breath." That wasn't just violence, that was catharsis. And it's worth noting, women trained for this. Not in official gyms, of course, but quietly, practically. Girls grew up knowing that this bizarre loophole might someday be their only option. Some practiced slingshotting apples in the woods. Others watched how women walked during fights, how they kept their balance, how they circled the pit, how they waited until the man was off-centre before striking. One woodcut from the 15th century even shows a woman mid-fight, stone flying, while the man in the pit stumbles backward. The crowd watches not with horror, but fascination. This was spectacle, this was law, this was marriage, medieval style. But not every woman fought alone. Sometimes the village cheered for her, especially if the husband was known to be cruel or miserly. In those cases, townsfolk might accidentally distract the bailiff or toss extra stones her way. One record mentions a fight where a woman named Gertrude was supplied with dried fruit mid-duel to strengthen her resolve. Her opponent, a cooper infamous for overcharging on barrels, she won in 3 throws. The village never paid full price again. And yes, some men abused the system too. There are cases of husbands goading their wives into combat, hoping to win and shut her up for good. Sometimes it worked, but not always. In 1312, a butcher in Augsburg mocked his wife into combat. Certain he'd win, she showed up with a perfectly balanced sling and a jawline that said she had nothing left to lose. By the time he regained consciousness, he was a single man But what about after the fight, if the woman won? The marriage was typically dissolved. She could return to her family or claim the house, depending on the verdict, if the man won. It depended if he stopped short of killing her. The court might order reconciliation. Yes, nothing says marriage repair, like someone who just tried to cave in your ribs. If someone died, the survivor walked free. This wasn't the norm. Of course, most medieval marriages didn't end in combat, but the fact that this option existed, that women could legally beat their husbands into annulment, tells you just how flexible the medieval legal imagination could be when faced with love gone sour. And that's the real twist here. For all its talk of purity and obedience, the medieval world knew marriage could be messy. It knew that love could turn to loathing, that patience wore thin, that no amount of church lecturing could fix a marriage poisoned by cruelty, neglect, or just the slow erosion of joy. So when all else failed, when prayers didn't work, when the priests wouldn't listen, and the neighbours were tired of hearing you complain, they gave you a pit, they gave you a rock, and they said, "Go ahead, resolve it yourselves." Now, you'd think that would be the ultimate endpoint, public combat, winner takes all. But no, as long as the church ruled the land, there were always more rules, more laws, more creative ways to stretch the definition of marriage until it screamed. Because after the pit came the penance, and it turns out even winners had sins to pay for. So don't go celebrating yet. The real consequences, they're waiting right around the corner. So, you've made it past the priests, the matrons, the forced bedroom solemnity, and now you've taken the plunge literally into the pit. If you thought marriage was difficult before, try swinging a club with one arm, while your wife pelts your head with rocks like it's laundry day, and she's sick of your socks. Welcome to the strangest chapter in marital jurisprudence, the Pit Duel Handbook, because of course, in true medieval fashion, fighting your spouse in a legally sanctioned brawl wasn't chaotic enough on its own. No, there had to be rules, specific ones, bizarre ones, and heaven help you if you wore the wrong pants. Let's start with the basics. You're a man who's been challenged by your wife to trial by combat. She's tired of your emotional unavailability, your stingy bread portions, or perhaps just your face. You're not allowed to say no. By the way, if the court accepts her request, you must appear. If you don't, you forfeit the case and she wins everything. You arrive at the duel site. A crowd gathers. There are no divorce lawyers here, just shouting villagers. 2 bailiffs with a questionable sense of fairness, and a notary who's way too excited to record fatal outcome due to foot misstep. Rule number 1, the man fights from inside a pit. This wasn't a metaphorical pit of despair. This was a literal, freshly dug hole, usually waist deep, around 4 to 5 feet across, lined with straw to soak up blood and pride. Why the pit? Well, it was meant to even the playing field, because men were presumed to be stronger. Restricting their movement was seen as a fair handicap. It wasn't. Rule number 2, the man may only use one hand. Yes, one hand, his dominant hand, if the court was feeling generous. His other arm was often tied behind his back, either with rope or tucked into a tunic sleeve. The idea was simple: you have more muscle. Okay, use less of it. And yet, somehow, men still manage to win a good percentage of these fights. Why? Because rule number 3, the woman fights from above, with a sling and 3 stones. 3, exactly 3, not 2, not 4. She was allowed 1 sling and 3 standardised stones, each one inspected and weighed before the duel to ensure fairness. Stones that were too light wouldn't count. Stones that were too heavy declared illegal. If she dropped one, slipped while aiming, or accidentally used her hands, disqualified. But here's where things get fascinating. The footwork mattered a lot. Standing above the pit meant you had the advantage of movement, but it also meant no armour, no heavy clothing, and no sturdy shoes. Why? Because the church, bless their cotton-wrapped hearts, wanted these fights to be fair and modest, enter the strange fashion of marital combat. For women, the expected attire was a chemise, a sort of long linen shift. Similar to an underdress, it had to be girded tightly, so she wouldn't trip, but not so tightly that it implied immodesty. Hair had to be braided or covered, because loose hair was seen as chaotic and distracting to the moral order. Shoes were optional. Some women fought barefoot, others in soft cloth slippers, but no boots. Definitely no boots. Those were too empowering. And the men, they often wore simple tunics shortened or tied up to avoid entanglement in the pit. No shoes, and nothing with buckles, buttons, or metal clasps, lest it give them a mechanical advantage. Basically, it was the fashion equivalent of being mugged at a monastery. Rule number 4, no speaking during the fight. Yes, you heard that right. No trash talk. No last-minute apologies. No declarations of love or regret. Once the bell, or whatever local object doubled as a bell, sounded. The only communication was stone meets flesh, club meets shin. Still, this didn't stop people from developing techniques. Take Eleanor of Ulm, whose 1326 duel was recorded in court notes as unorthodox. In style, but effective in execution, Elena used her sling not just to throw, but to entangle her opponent's club, wrapping it mid-swing and yanking it from his hand. She won, but was fined for creative violence, a term which should absolutely make a comeback in modern courts. Then there was Hildegard the Bold, who trained in private by slingshotting apples off her barn roof. Her aim was so precise that she reportedly struck her husband square in the ear, knocking him unconscious before the third stone. A local priest declared it the hand of God. And let's not forget Franz the Forgettable, a man who wore his wedding boots into the pit, stumbled on straw, and fell face first before the duel began. His wife didn't even have to throw a stone, she just waited. Franz was declared defeated due to unfit footing. He later sued the bailiff for improper pit raking. The case was dismissed. Historians still argue how widespread these pit duels really were. Some believe they were more common in legal folklore than actual practice. Others point to surviving court records, illustrations, and town chronicles that describe these events with disturbingly gleeful detail. Regardless, the rules existed, the gear existed, and people showed up to watch. Oh yes, the audience. These fights were public affairs, town squares, fairgrounds. Even church courtyards were used as duel sites. People brought snacks. They cheered, they placed bets. Children sat on rooftops, sometimes. Musicians were hired to play during the match, giving the whole thing the vibe of an angry Renaissance festival. And they didn't just watch, they judged. If a participant used a forbidden move, like striking with both hands, or throwing a rock outside the allowed zone, the crowd might boo or shout. The bailiff could stop the match and declare a technical foul, which was somehow both hilarious and horrifying when the stakes were, murder or divorce. But for all the absurdity, mistakes in the pit could be fatal. One misstep, one drop stone, one ill-timed swing. These duels were messy. There were no helmets, no gloves, no magic clerics to resurrect you. If you got knocked down and couldn't get back up, that was that. The marriage was over, one way or another. Yet some couples fought not to end their marriage, but to settle arguments within it. Who would keep the house? Who owned the cow whose mother insulted whom first in these cases? The fight wasn't for freedom, but dominance, and often. The loser stayed married just slightly more bruised and significantly more humble. But perhaps the most terrifying rule of all, there was no appeal. The fight ended when someone was incapacitated, surrendered, or died. Whatever the outcome, it was considered God's judgment. No second chances, no retrials. You couldn't claim temporary sling blindness or pre-existing pit vertigo. Once the notary inked the verdict, It was as binding as any royal seal. So what have we learned? Well, if you're going to challenge your spouse to combat, don't wear boots. Practice your sling work. Pray you're not fighting someone named Hildegard. And maybe, just maybe, consider talking things out instead. But then again, where's the drama in that? Next, we'll leave the pit behind and enter the world of spectacle, politics, and public performance, where some duels weren't about justice at all, but about who looked better in the retelling. By now, you've taken your swing maybe several, you've slipped in the straw, grunted through the one-handed flailing, and you've learned firsthand how 3 stones in the right hands can be more persuasive than a dozen priests in a courtroom. But let's step back for a moment, because this thing you're doing, this shouting, swinging, cheering, sweating ritual in the town square, this isn't just some isolated squabble between 2 people who need separate bedrooms. No, what you're part of is state-sanctioned theatre, a full-on medieval stage production with an audience, a moral message, and more drama than a tavern brawl at closing time. Because believe it or not, trial by combat wasn't just law, it was spectacle. It was the show. Let's paint the scene. You're standing in a sunlit town square. Flags flutter from stone turrets. Merchants pull their carts to the edge of the square to get a good view. A trumpet blares. Someone's already selling roasted nuts and stale gingerbread. Children scurry under benches. The town crier's voice cracks as he reads the names of the duelists, like an announcer at a royal joust. And there you are, you, freshly oiled and awkwardly barefoot, about to settle your marital grievances in full view of every curious peasant and opportunistic poet in a 15-mile radius. This is not justice behind closed doors. This is theatre, and like all good performances, it has layers. The legal layer comes first, on paper. Trial by combat was about divine judgment. The idea was that God would grant victory to the party in the right, if you survived, or your opponent yielded. It was proof of your moral purity. If you lost, well, sorry, apparently. Your argument didn't carry divine favour. No appeals, no mercy, end of show. But behind that holy smokescreen lay a far more human motive politics. Because whether you were a peasant fighting for land or a nobleman trying to preserve his name, winning in the pit wasn't just about proving your case, it was about public narrative. And the public was very, very interested. Historians still argue whether some duels were staged or encouraged by local lords looking to stir excitement or reinforce their authority. After all, a well-timed combat could distract a town from tax hikes, bad harvests, or the inconvenient disappearance of a bishop's funds. What better way to unify the people than a live-action morality play featuring 2 locals with grudges? Grudges and very poor impulse control. And boy, did people show up. Duels drew crowds. In larger cities like Paris, Augsburg and London, duels between nobles or high-ranking knights could draw hundreds, even thousands of spectators. Temporary scaffolding would be built, clergy would be invited, merchants would display wares, taverns would open early. It was the medieval version of pay-per-view. Even rural pit fights between spouses could attract dozens of villagers, eager for a break from the monotony of crop rotation and lice picking. These duels weren't just law, they were entertainment, and people treated them like sport. They bet on winners, they judged footwork, they gasped at clever moves, and booed at poor swings. Think of it as a medieval UFC, but with more straw and fewer shirts. And of course, everyone had an opinion. Oh, she holds her sling too high. He's too slow on his left turn. She's wearing the wrong belt for that posture. Did you hear he's been drinking vinegar all week to strengthen his nerves? In one case recorded in 1370, a baker's duel with his wife drew such a crowd that the local priest had to delay mass. Children climbed rooftops. Old men sold victory tokens, basically. Cursed acorns, painted gold. When the wife landed a sling, hit to the man's stomach, the entire square erupted in cheers, and someone released a trained goose in celebration. Nobody knows why. The goose was not part of the legal process. Then there were the stylized moves. Yes, even in battle, style mattered. It wasn't enough to win, you had to look good doing it. A clean spin, a precise sling, a feint that made your opponent stumble backward into the pit's wall. These moments would be talked about for weeks, in some cases, years. Ballads were written. One anonymous 14th century tune opens with, "In the pit where straw did curl, Gerda twirled and made him hurl." No, it wasn't Shakespeare, but it did rhyme. Now imagine you're a minor noble, and you've just been accused of breaking a marriage contract. You could deny it, of course, but why not win public sympathy and a little street cred at the same time? You hire a herald, you arrive on horseback, you wear a tunic embroidered with your family crest. Maybe you even choreograph your fight a little, just enough for the crowd to see that you're honourable, strong, and probably in the right. Lose, you're a tragic hero. Win, you're a local legend. Die, well, poetic justice, I guess. And let's not forget the wardrobe. You already know about the rules: no armour, no unfair shoes, no flashy jewellery. But that didn't stop duellists from turning their outfits into statements. A noble woman might show up in modest linen, embroidered with her family's crest, kind of political branding. A merchant might wear the colours of his guild. One couple reportedly arrived in matching blue and green tunics, stitched with wheat sheaves, a not so subtle nod to their disputed barley farm. It wasn't just what you did in the pit, it was how you framed it. The duel, after all, wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was happening in a world of power, perception, and small-town gossip on steroids. And even after the last blow was struck, the performance wasn't over. The victory walk mattered. If you won and limped away with dignity, people remembered you as brave. If you cackled like a gremlin and danced on your opponent's cloak, you were just a sore winner and probably cursed by 3 old widows by sundown. Some courts even arranged peace feasts after particularly scandalous fights. You and your ex-spouse would sit bandaged, bitter, and bruised at opposite ends of a communal table, eating stew while the townspeople toasted the end of the conflict. No, it wasn't comfortable. Yes, sometimes there were additional arguments over bread distribution, but it was all part of the show. And what did it achieve? Well, sometimes justice, sometimes closure, sometimes just entertainment. Because medieval society understood something that many modern systems forget. Justice isn't just about truth, it's about narrative. Who looks righteous? Who appears strong? Who endures humiliation with grace or pride? Or at least a decent swing. And if you could survive the duel not just physically, but socially, you left the pit with more than just a verdict. You left with a story, one that would be retold in markets, embroidered into tapestries, whispered at weddings, and eventually written into history books by people like us, shaking our heads and muttering, "They really settled divorce like that." But don't close the curtain just yet, because in the wings of this absurd, bloody theatre, there's still a final twist waiting, one that no crowd can predict, and no duel can solve. Sometimes, even after the last stone is thrown, the real battle is only beginning. You've seen the pit, you've survived the sling, you've limped out of marital combat with dignity, or maybe just fewer teeth. But now, my friend, we step away from village pits and straw-lined justice tonight. We climb out of the muddy arena and onto the glittering stage of royal spectacle, because if medieval trial by combat had a finale, a grand, operatic crescendo, it was this one. The last officially sanctioned duel in France, the stuff of legend, Jean de Carouge versus Jacques Le Gris. This wasn't a lover's spat, it was something far darker. A duel not over goats or gossip, but over honour, vengeance, and one woman's word against a nobleman's denial. And it all ends before the king. Picture this, it's 1386. Paris. Winter bites the air. The Seine moves slow and black beneath a sky the colour of old wool. But today, the city is alive with anticipation. Horses clatter down cobbled streets. Markets close early. Nobles abandon their wine to crowd the royal square at the Abbey of Saint-Martin-des-Champs. Everyone who's anyone is here, because today, blood will settle truth. Let's rewind just a bit. Jean de Carouges is a knight proud, stubborn, battle-worn, the kind of man who stares down hardship and shouts again, born into minor Norman nobility. He's the medieval version of a guy who always parks too close to the jousting lane and doesn't apologise for it. His marriage to Marguerite de Thibauville, however, is seen as an upward move. She's intelligent, well-connected, and in a detail many forget sharp as any blade her husband carries. But then comes Jacques Legris, smooth-talking, popular, educated, a court favourite of Count Pierre. Jean's rival in nearly every way, where Jean is iron, Jacques is velvet, and yet somehow their paths cross again and again, first in courtly disputes, then in property disagreements, and eventually in something far worse. One winter's day, Jean leaves town for business. While he's away, Marguerite is allegedly raped in her own home by none other than Legris himself. She reports it. She tells Jean, who returns furious and full of fire. But this isn't a simple criminal case. It's aristocracy. It's politics. It's her word against his. Legris denies everything. Count Pierre, his patron, backs him. Local courts stall. Evidence is minimal. Witnesses are shaky. And the church, surprise, surprise, urges discretion and silence. But Jean does not go quietly. He takes the case directly to the King of France, Charles VI, demanding a judicial duel, trial by combat, a divine judgment, a battle to the death, where God himself will choose the righteous. And incredibly, the king agrees, which brings us to December 29th, 1386, the day of the duel. A wooden arena is built. Elevated stands line the courtyard. Nobility swells in fur-lined cloaks. The royal family watches from above, their breath visible in the cold. Trumpets sound, banners flap, and from opposite gates, the knights emerge fully armoured, glinting like twin nightmares under a steel-grey sky. Jean wears white, Legris black. Now here's the hook, this wasn't just spectacle, this was a matter of life and law. If Jean lost, it wouldn't just mean death, it meant Marguerite had lied, and for that, she'd be burned alive. Yes, the stakes were that high, no pressure. They begin on horseback. Lances shatter against shields. Horses crash into one another. Hooves sliding in frozen dirt. Both men fall. They rise slowly, heavily, like mountains trying to kill each other. Axes are drawn, then swords. Steel rings out against steel. Sparks fly. The crowd holds its breath. It is brutal, not poetic, not graceful. Two armoured bodies smashing, grappling, grunting. Jean takes a slash to the thigh. Legris stumbles on chainmail. And then, finally, Jean knocks Jacques to the ground. He straddles him, raises his dagger, and demands, one last time, a confession. Legris refuse. Jean drives the blade through his throat. It is over. The king rises, the court erupts. Jean is vindicated. Marguerite is safe. And Legris' history will argue over his innocence for centuries. Because here's the twist, we still don't know who told the truth. Marguerite never recanted. She stood by her story until death. Jean became a hero, even earning a place on the king's council. But whispers endured. Some believed Legris was framed, caught in a feud between bitter men. Others point to his reputation, his access, and the courage it took for Marguerite to speak out in a world that preferred women silent. Historians still debate it. Did divine justice triumph? Or did a man with more political muscle simply win the narrative? We may never know, but what we do know is this duel changed everything. It marked the end of an era. while judicial duels had been popular throughout Europe for centuries. This was the last officially sanctioned one in France. Afterward, Parliament began phasing them out. The church grew louder in its opposition, and gradually, the idea that guilt or innocence could be proved by sword faded into memory, but not before searing itself into legend. Paintings were made, songs were sung. The duel became a kind of national myth, equal parts legal drama, romantic tragedy, and military spectacle. And Marguerite, she became an icon, not a passive victim, but a woman whose refusal to stay silent forced a king to raise a theatre of blood for justice. And Jean, for all his gruffness and armour. He was a man who gambled everything, his life, his wife's life, his honour on the belief that right would win in the end. It's the kind of story that makes you wonder if love is a battlefield. What happens when that battlefield becomes real? Would you fight for your partner like that? Would your partner fight for you? Or would you both agree to split the goat and never speak again, regardless of your answer? Remember this for one brief moment in the 14th century. A royal courtyard became a place where love, law, and violence collided beneath the eyes of God and monarchy, and two armoured men showed the world just how messy truth can be. Now, you might think this was the peak of medieval madness, but there's more. Because what happens after the fighting ends? Well, that's when the church comes knocking again with quills, penance, and moral receipts you didn't know you were racking up. Time to pay for your sins, even if you're already bruised from battle. So, the swords are back in their scabbards, the mud has dried, the sling stones have long since rolled into history. You think the dust has settled, that the dramatic duels and roaring crowds were the climax of medieval marital justice. Not quite, because while trial by combat was the showy, muscle-bound climax of conflict, the real magic happened quietly in parchments, loopholes, whispers in taverns, and yes, sometimes in well-timed sobs before the bishop. Welcome to the tangled underworld of love, lies, and legal loopholes, where not every marriage ended in bloodshed, but nearly every ending involved a little trickery. You see, when divorce was all but impossible, thanks to the iron grip of the church and the deep suspicion of anyone who claimed their spouse just wasn't the same anymore, clever minds found cleverer ways to wriggle free. Not everyone wanted a duel, not everyone had the upper arm strength or a dramatic flair for courtroom theatrics. Some people just wanted out, or property, or maybe just peace and fewer sermons about marital duties. And that's where the loopholes crept in like rats under a monastery door. Let's start with the big one, annulment. Unlike divorce, which was heresy in the eyes of the church, an annulment didn't end a marriage. It simply declared that it had never legally existed in the first place. Poof, like it never happened. You could be married for 10 years, have children, share a cottage, a goat, and a mild foot fungus, and still claim, with a straight face, that the whole thing was invalid, and people did, constantly. Now, you'd think annulments would be rare, saved for true cases of mistaken identity or unexpected consanguinity, a fancy term for you accidentally married your cousin. But no, the list of accepted reasons was expansive, flexible, and extremely useful for those who knew how to work it. Take lack of consent. Claim you were forced into the marriage, that your family threatened you, that you were drunk, that you misunderstood the ceremony, that you thought I do meant maybe if you cried hard enough, or had a cousin in the clergy. This argument might just hold, or pre-contract. This one's a favourite. Say you had a verbal agreement to marry someone else before your current spouse. That prior promise, however flimsy, could render the new marriage invalid. No proof, no problem. Just summon a friend to say, "Oh yes, he definitely told me he'd marry Helga. Swore it over a cup of mead." Then there's impotence. We've already visited that awkward courtroom striptease in section 4, but here's the kicker: many people faked it. Husbands who wanted out of marriages Suddenly plagued by mystery flaccidity, wives claimed their husbands couldn't perform in a proper Christian way, and if you were brave, you'd demand a public test because nothing says dignity like proving virility in front of 6 appointed strangers with clipboards. But let's not pretend it was always a ploy. Sometimes these loopholes were all people had, for women especially, in a world where they couldn't own land outright or leave an abusive husband without permission. The law became their battlefield, and their weapon wasn't a sword, it was narrative. Historians still debate how often women successfully used the church's own logic against it. But case records tell us this: they tried, they got creative, and when swords failed them, they picked up scripture and found the cracks. There's the famous case of Agnes of Lyon, who claimed her husband was spiritually poisoned, literally cursed with lust for demons. Was it true? Probably not. But the court, uncomfortable with exorcism logistics, granted her an annulment just to avoid a theological migraine. Or Frieda of Mainz, who smuggled letters to her bishop detailing her husband's blasphemous bedtime chants, an obsession with moon cycles. Was he just really into astrology? Maybe. But Frieda got her annulment and the house. And let's not forget the property angle, because sometimes these breakups weren't about abuse or trauma. Sometimes they were just plain economic strategy. Imagine you're a landless noble. You marry up, but 5 years in, your wife's brother reclaims the estate. Suddenly you're couch surfing in the stables and being served oats cold. What do? Duel him, risk death, or claim the marriage was invalid due to insufficient dowry documentation and file an annulment? Loophole. Even better, say your wife's father promised a dowry of 12 cows, but only delivered 10 and one suspicious-looking goat. That's fraudulent contract terms. My friend, are grounds for annulment. And if the goat bites your mother emotional distress, add it to the ledger. In many cases, annulment became the poor man's duel. Same results, less bruising. Now, if you were truly bold and a little morally flexible, you could flip the game entirely and marry someone new before the paperwork finished. Risky, sure. Illegal, absolutely. But in some places, if your first marriage had enough grey areas, you might get away with it. You just had to move fast, get remarried in another parish, claim ignorance, say your dog ate the documents, blame a bishop, blame that bishop's dog, or just fake your own death. It happened. Enough times to be noted by chroniclers with quiet disapproval and secret admiration. And of course, the church's tolerance for these stunts varied wildly. Some dioceses were strict, others were sleepy. Some bishops hated marital litigation and pushed everything to Rome, where papal courts took years to process a single annulment. That delay, a gift to the loophole artist. Others knew how to grease the wheels. A donation here, a chicken for Father Thomas there, a promise to host next year's feast day. Suddenly, your once indissoluble marriage was unravelling faster than a monk's patience during Lent. It wasn't all scams, of course, there were real tragedies, real people trapped, real cries for help in the form of formal pleas written on parchment, soaked with tears or rain, depending on who you believe. But even then there was a performative element. Airing your dirty laundry wasn't just for privacy, it was a strategy. Public shame could tip the scales. Villagers loved a scandal. The more dramatic your story, the more likely the local clergy felt pressure to resolve the issue, just to shut everyone up. If your husband was found drunk in the pigsty again, tell the baker, tell the priest, tell everyone, soon. He's not just a bad husband, he's an embarrassment to the parish. And when reputation collapses, even the sturdiest marriage contract buckles under the weight of social disgust. By the end of the Middle Ages, this pattern was clear. When direct divorce was denied, people made their own exits. Some through combat, some through courts, some through stories stretched thin as old bread. But all of them were navigating a system that seemed determined to keep couples bound, whether or not love, sanity, or basic hygiene survived the binding. And in a way, it's oddly comforting. Human creativity always finds cracks. Love may be eternal, but so is petty ingenuity. Now, you might think this is where the story ends: tangled laws, dramatic duels, shady bishops, but there's one more stop before we drift off for the night. A quieter one, a softer one, because after all that sweat, ink and stone throwing, what did medieval people really think love was? Let's take a breath, step out of the courtroom, and wander into the garden of medieval hearts, flawed. Yes, but still dreaming. So, after the bruises and broken contracts, after the duels in dirt pits and tearful annulments whispered in cathedral halls, you might be wondering, was love ever safe in the Middle Ages? Was it always bound by contracts, bruised by lawsuits, or literally bludgeoned with a rock tied to a woman's skirt? Did anyone get to simply be in love? Tonight, for our final stroll through this twisted garden of medieval marriage, let's dim the torches and step into something a little more tender, a little more human, because despite everything the papal decrees, the trial by combat, the impotency panels, and goat-based dowry scandals, medieval people did, in fact, love. They just loved under watchful eyes and impossible rules. And yet, even then, they found ways to keep the flame alive. Now, you've already seen how marriages were forged not always by affection, but by alliance. A lord marries a merchant's daughter for her land. A peasant girl is traded like a sheep with a nice laugh. A young man pledges his life to a noble woman twice his age to erase his father's debt. Love, it seemed, was more of a bonus feature than a default setting. But that didn't stop people from hoping. Courtly love, amour, courtois, as the French called it, began to bloom in the 12th century. Imagine troubadours with lutes slung across their backs, composing verse not for their wives, but for the unattainable lady in the tower. These were songs of yearning, of stolen glances and aching fidelity, romanticised absolutely, but they gave language to the longing that people, for all their rigid institutions, still felt. Love in the Middle Ages was often illegal before it was ideal. Married nobles wrote secret letters to distant flames. Widowed women visited the graves of former husbands long after they remarried. Monks scribbled poems about women they barely remembered, even in convents. Forbidden crushes blossomed between novices and the occasional charismatic priest passing through for confession duty. Historians still argue whether these expressions were genuine rebellion or simply emotional survival. But they were real, written in margins, carved into beams, sung in candlelit halls, whispered in gardens beneath cloisters where no one was supposed to be listening. Even the church, with all its obsession over missionary-only bedroom conduct, couldn't completely suppress the idea that love might transcend its own rules. Medieval sermons often warned against romantic obsession, but some sly preachers slipped in metaphors so flowery. They sounded like wedding vows themselves, and ordinary people. They invented rituals of affection where doctrine gave them none. A peasant wife might bake bread with a single sprig of thyme because it was his favourite. A husband might carve his initials into the beam above their shared bed, even if he could barely write his name. Some couples exchanged tokens, handkerchiefs, charms, coins wrapped in ribbon, not as legal promises, but personal ones. And of course, there were the confessional workarounds. Say you wanted to tell someone you loved them, but you weren't betrothed. Well, don't say it outright. Say, I would carry your water through winter, or your name makes my breath warm. Romantic nonsense. Sure, but it got the point across, and as long as no one caught you in the hayloft, it was technically not a sin. Then there's the letter from a young wife in 1293 addressed to her husband, who had joined a pilgrimage to Santiago. Your shoes still sit by the fire. I warm them, though you are far. The baby says your name like it is his own. No bishop signed it, no seal of legal approval, just affection in its simplest form. And that's what we've been dancing around, isn't it? That love in the Middle Ages was never quite safe, but it survived anyway. It bloomed in cracks between stone walls, it sang in coded ballads, and snuck between lines of dull Latin scripture. It screamed from the pit when a wife clobbered her husband with a rock, and whispered behind confession screens when a man begged forgiveness for a kiss that never happened. Love was risk. It was always risk. And maybe that's why people fought so hard sometimes, literally to defend it, redefine it, or escape the version of it they were forced into. Because not all medieval love stories were tragedies. Some couples did stay together, not because they had to, but because they chose to, through frostbitten winters, bad harvests, plagues and gossip. Some husbands, when their wives were accused of witchcraft, stood in the town square and shouted, "Then I am a witch too." Some wives, when their husbands were dragged to duel over old debts, disguised themselves as servants just to sneak into the crowd and pray near the pit. These weren't the stories the church recorded, but they lived on in folk songs, in family stories, in the way a child might be named after the mother's first love, because he died young, and she never forgot him. Even the most infamous duels, like Jean de Carouge and Le Gris, were rooted in more than law. They were rooted in the terrifying, imperfect courage it takes to believe someone, to say, "I stand by your word even if I must fight to the death for it." Do you see the thread now? From the courtroom undressing to the pit brawl with rocks. From goat-based annulments to secret letters passed between convent windows. All of it was about agency, about reclaiming the right to feel, to choose, to say no, or yes, or not anymore. And even when love didn't last, the effort did. The struggle to protect it, the need to define it on your own terms. The longing to be seen not just as a spouse, but as a soul. That's the real legacy of medieval marriage. Not just the combat, not just the spectacle, but the deeply human desire to make meaning out of something as chaotic, inconvenient, and fragile as love. So, tonight, as you settle into your own soft sheets, no hay, no lice, no witnesses with clipboards, I hope you feel a little luckier. Relationships may still be messy, sure, but at least you don't have to prove your affection with a public erection trial. And if you ever do find yourself stuck in a medieval marriage, just remember there's always a loophole or a rock, whichever comes first.